Welcome back to yet another day of quarantining, and so we got some online notes for us. Okay, in 6.1, it's having us find these different solutions to inverse trig functions. So to warm us up, it says, find two acute angles in our right triangles who have those three side lengths. Express your answer using degree mode measure. So make sure your calculator, if it's not, is in degree for this first part, because we'll want it back in radians the next. All right, so I like to just draw a right triangle. And as you think about these side lengths, the longest, the 625, has to be the hypotenuse, and then the other two are the side lengths. So I'm going to call this in the lower left alpha, the upper top beta. If you wanted to find alpha, it really doesn't matter which two sides you used. So for example, I could label the closest side, that this is the adjacent, and the other closest side is the hypotenuse. But depending on what two sides you use, you then want to use that inverse trig function. So in this case, I've got the adjacent hypotenuse, so I do inverse cosine or arc cosine of 257 over 625. And when you do that, you end up with 57.48 degrees. To find beta, you can do a similar thing and use another trig function, although it actually is probably easier just to say, okay, well, if I've got a 90 degree and the angles in a triangle add up to 180, 180 minus 90 is 90. So if I just take 90 and I minus this 57.48, I'll end up with the other angle, which is 32.52 degrees. All right, that gets us in the right mindset. Let's go ahead and take a look now at solving these different inverse trig equations. So it says solve these equations to approximate the solutions that lie in that interval to 4 decimal places. So notice 0 to 2 pi, we should be in radians for the second part. Okay, as we look at sine of x equals 7/11, we're talking about, in this case, in order to find x, you would do arc, or the inverse sine, right? So arc sine of 7/11. Okay, that is one correct solution, but it wants to approximate all the solutions. So remember, which angle is that? That's going to give us out an angle. And when we get that angle, it's equivalent to every angle that rotates back onto itself 360 degrees, or in this case, 2 pi. So remember, we do plus 2 pi k to represent those other angles. Okay, let's think for a minute. So it will always give us an angle in that first or second quadrant. In this case, it gave us 2 in the first quadrant. However, we also have an angle in the second quadrant that is equivalent. So let's think about that second quadrant. If we had like 30 degrees, what is that angle in the second quadrant? Well, something like 30 degrees in the second quadrant is just 180 minus that 30. Or in this case, since we're talking about radians, we would take pi minus the angle we know, which is arc sine of 7/11. But if we were to represent all the equivalent ones of them, we're going to do plus 2 pi k, and technically that's for any integer k. Okay, if we want the exact decimals, then we're going to type in arc sine, or inverse sine of 7/11 in our calculator, and we get out 0.6898. And then, I guess I should say like k, to type in your calculator, you just use this first part, and then you do the pi minus that answer as your second approximate answer, and we get 2.4518 as our approximate values. And remember, in all these cases, you should have 2 different approximate values. Okay, so let's look at this next one with cosine. So once again, if we want the exact answer, we're going to do x equals arc cosine to give us back the angle of -2/9. But if we want all the equivalent ones, we're going to add the 2 pi k. Okay, for cosine, all students take calculus. It's going to give us that the value, not in the first quadrant here, but actually the second quadrant, because then all of a sudden we'll have cosine as negative, right? So when we get out that value in the second quadrant, if we want the other negative one, we're going to be in the third quadrant. So I feel like there's 2 ways to think about this. Well, if this is something like, I don't know, just to give you an example, 150 degrees, then if we wanted something in this other quadrant, we could just call it negative 150 degrees, right? So we could call this negative arc cosine of 2/9 plus 2 pi k. Okay, your other option is to take 2 pi, and if we take that angle, and we take the whole 2 pi and we subtract it from it, the arc cosine and negative 2/9, these are equivalent. So these two are the same way to write the same thing. So you really only have one and then two answers, but you can kind of choose which way you like to write the second one. Okay, then we're just to the stage of plugging in our calculator. So arc cosine of negative 2/9, and our calculator gives us 1.7949. As for this other one, you could type in the negative, right? And if you type in the negative arc cosine, you get negative 1.749. But then you are going to have to add the 2 pi because it asks us between 0 and 2 pi. So when we add the 2 pi, we get 4.4883 as an equivalent, or another approximate answer. Okay, let's look at the next one. The next one, we got secant. So remind yourself, I'm going to do a little side note over here, like secant of x is the same as 1 over cosine. So therefore, this equation, 1 over cosine, is equal to 1 divided by 3/2. So if I wanted to flip that fraction, you'd have cosine of x equals 2/3. And I think that is going to be easier to solve with. Your calculator does not actually have like arc secant, arc cosecant. So you're going to always have to convert it to sine, cosine, and tangent. So our answer here, if I now think about solving that, is just x equals arc cosine of 2/3. And if I want to represent all of them, I'm going to add that 2 pi k. And then you say to yourself, well, all students take calculus. Cosine will also be positive in the fourth quadrant. So you could say, well, hey, that's the positive angle here in the first quadrant. I could just take the negative one, and then that will be in the fourth quadrant, right? Plus 2 pi k. Or an equivalent statement to that is, hey, I can take the whole 2 pi and subtract that little angle. So 2 pi minus arc cosine of 2/3 plus 2 pi k. And that's two ways to write an equivalent angle for that second one. Okay, once again, if we're trying to approximate, at that stage we're typing things in our calculator. So you type in the inverse cosine of 2/3 and you get x equals 0.8411. Do the same thing with the 2 pi minus that answer, and we get 5.4421. Okay, let's now look at tangent. So for tangent, we're going to do, as you might realize, arc tangent of negative square root of 10. Okay, as you think about tangent, all students take calculus. This gave us something in the first quadrant. We know the third quadrant will also, this gave us something in the second quadrant, right, because it's negative, not positive. And we know the fourth quadrant will be equivalent. But if you recall the graph of tangent, remember this has a slightly different period. How often does this graph repeat? It repeats every pi. So, I mean, you could do 2 pi minus this angle, or, I take that back. You could then figure out kind of where that reference angle is in relation to the fourth quadrant. However, it's going to be a lot easier just to think, hey, this repeats every pi, so I'm adding pi k. And then you just have, that represents multiple answers, but it's of that one format. So as we approximate, we're going to do x equals, we type in arc tangent of negative square root of 10 on our calculator, and we get 1.8771. I actually lied to you. I think when you type in your calculator, you get negative 1.2645. But since we want things to be in the interval 0 to 2 pi, I added pi to that, then get that angle in the third quadrant. I think it usually gives you things either in the first and second or first and fourth, depending on which function it is, trig function. And then if I add another pi to that, I get 5.0187. Okay, I'm going to give you the answer to this next one, but I want you to kind of reason through why this would be the case. X will equal arctangent of 117 plus pi k, and your approximate answers are x equals 223, and 4.7034. All right, that's it for 6.1. You're now ready to do